Aisha, are we live?
We are live on YouTube and I'm getting ready to start the webinar if you're ready.
Great, ready to go. Thank you for joining us this afternoon at our second roundtable on revising our accountability framework. I am Leah Cruzy, board chair. Joining me are my fellow board members and colleagues, Vice Chair Jim Sandman, Secretary Ricardo Ganjan, Treasurer Chantel Wright, and Nick Rodriguez. Our Executive Director, Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis, will facilitate today's discussion to allow each of us to fully participate in this important topic. It's important to share that the board will not be taking a vote this evening. This roundtable is an informational hearing for the public to listen and learn, and a forum for all the board members to discuss the framework together. The School Reform Act, the SRA, grants the DC Public Charter School Board authority to hold DC Public Charter Schools accountable for fulfilling their duties and obligations under the SRA. Put in other words, as the appointed authorizing body to the city's charter sector, we are the entity responsible for deciding A, whether a charter applicant should be given a charter to serve students, B, for monitoring those schools' compliance with the laws and results they achieve with students, and C, for closing low-performing schools. The business of this body, appointed board members that deliberate together on high-stakes decisions impacting school communities and the professional staff that operate the agency day to day, is to provide oversight for the sector, with each local educational agency, a charter governed by their board, agreeing to autonomy in exchange for accountability. This structure makes public charter schools uniquely capable of delivering programmatic models to meet a student's unique learning needs so that they succeed. To that end, each one of us has sworn the same oath to this city and to our country, informed by our decisions by facts, the authorizing law, and by our unique lived experience and expertise. With differing perspectives and experiences, we are all drawn to our service, motivated by the promise and potential of a great education. I learn and make informed decisions thanks to what I learned both from my fellow board members, from the devoted staff of the DC PCSB, the DC community, and from national experts. This evening, I look forward to hearing from two leading voices with expertise in school accountability systems. Can we move to slide 2? Thank you. As I've said before, and it's worth repeating, developing, implementing, and evaluating schools using an accountability framework is not a new practice for DC PCSB. We have a long history of strong accountability, as you can see from this slide. It's a commitment to the lifelong success of the students of the District of Columbia that has grounded and informed the revision of our accountability framework over time. Our work on the framework started before the pandemic and before Dr. Michelle Walker-Davis started as our executive director. To date, our data and accountability team have spent countless hours researching, evaluating, and analyzing various accountability frameworks and metrics, in addition to working with national experts. The COVID-19 pandemic showed us that our oversight tools are nimble and that we have an opportunity to refine our authorizing practices and re-examine the data we use for our decision-making that exclusively evaluates every public charter school in Washington, D.C. on common metrics across student groups. It is our hope that by revising our accountability framework, we can hold ourselves and public charter schools to a higher standard. We have no public witnesses this evening, so with that, I will now turn it over to Dr. Walker-Davis to facilitate today's discussion. Dr. Walker-Davis.
Thank you, Chair Cruzy, and welcome members of the board. My team and I are looking forward to having this robust discussion. We have a lot to discuss before we dive in, so I'd like to start, as I did at our last roundtable, by checking in, sharing where we are with respect to our 4 agreements and reminding us of our meeting norms. So you'll see here on this slide representation of some of the work that we have begun here at DCPCSB. As you know, we've embarked on our own racial equity journey, and we use the Courageous Conversation Protocol to engage in dialogue about race. This protocol helps us engage with one another with honesty, open-mindedness, and vulnerability, to listen deeply, to better understand perspectives, and acknowledge discomfort when we experience it. And we use this protocol also as a way of practicing continuously how we stay engaged in our conversations. So I want to start again by modeling how we check in using our compass, and then I will invite board members to do the same. So today, I am showing up in the believing and acting spaces on the compass. Believing because I deeply believe every student should have access and opportunity to reach their highest potential. And I see our oversight work here at DC-PCSB as contributing to that goal. And acting, as I was at the last time that we had the roundtable, I'm in a facilitator role today. And so that has me very focused on doing in particular and paying attention to where our conversation goes. So I will ask board members to check in on where they are using the compass, and also remind you to think about the 4 agreements that you see listed on this sheet. This is similar to how one might navigate meeting norms, but we use the 4 agreements to remind us to stay committed to the conversation, to stay engaged, to speak our truth, to experience discomfort, which will naturally come with any conversations that are of any significance. And most of all, which is probably going to be my challenge this evening and many of our board members, which is to expect and accept non-closure. We have a 2-hour discussion this evening. We are not going to get to every problem that is before us, but we certainly want to have a robust discussion on the agenda items. So I am going to ask board members to check in on where you are with the compass, and also to just name what agreement you are going to lean into for today's conversation. And if I may, Chair Kruse, can I start with you?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Walker-Davis. I think today I am showing up as thinking and acting. I don't feel like I'm acting. I'm called to the relational bit here. I'm really looking forward to hearing from my fellow board members and the kind of productive learning opportunity this is to, as we are moving toward making some important decisions. Every opportunity we have together as a board to do this, I feel like I'm learning. The thinking piece is obviously the important work we have before us, and look forward to learning from the national experts who've generously offered to join us today. The identities I'm bringing to this discussion are both as a policy expert who believes deeply in both the power of knowledge and the potential of each human being, and the responsibility we have as this body to bring each of our areas of expertise, whether it's in schools or in my case, working in public policy at all levels of government, working in advocacy, having taught, and also being a parent. For the 4 agreements, I guess it's the 4th, expect and accept non-disclosure. Non-closure. I think there's so many layers to this framework, and so many ways in which our many LEAs can relate to it and may have reactions to it in many different school communities. So I think I am looking forward to hearing from the national experts and knowing that we may not come to a clear conclusion on any one particular element of the revised accountability framework today, and I have to be okay with that. So with that, I will popcorn it to Ricardo.
Great, thank you, Leah. So coming into today's conversation, I am thinking and feeling, really wanting to learn more and approach this with an understanding from our national experts on how we can continue to evolve our model. And from a feeling perspective, just that human-centered perspective that is so important and is part of my natural work in human capital and change management and human resources. So that's sort of the perspective and lens that I'm bringing today. And my agreement that I'm focused on also is expecting and accepting non-closure, as this will be an ongoing process for some time to come. And I will pop it over to Chantel.
Good afternoon, everyone. Like Ricarda, I am also in the thinking and feeling quadrants. Thinking because I'm very excited to have our national experts here to just share broader perspective, diving into research and data. So that causes some real thinking happening there. And feeling just because we are getting closer every time we talk about this accountability framework to getting to decision points and thinking about really important pieces and just feeling the weight of that is heavy each time we do this work, and really wanting to get it right and hope that we use this opportunity to do something different, but impactful for communities who so desperately need us to get it together and are expecting for us to get it right. In terms of my agreements, I think mine is going to be experience discomfort, specifically when we speak to our data national expert, where I think my colleague Nick will probably be on cloud 9. That will be for me an area of discomfort in terms of just making sure I understand numbers and data and research, et cetera. So I'm ready to experience some real discomfort. And so with that, I will turn it over to Nick, who's probably on cloud 9.
Oh man, yeah. All right. So definitely setting the bar high here. Yeah, thank you so much, board member. Right. I think so for me, I'm where Ricarda is on thinking and feeling. I think I've just been thinking a lot about how making decisions like this about an accountability framework that affects the lives of so many people and the decisions of so many, you want it to stand up to intellectual scrutiny. And it needs to be right for the people involved. And that it involves being able to do both of those things that are on opposite ends of the compass. So I'm thinking a lot about that right now. I hope I'm comfortable with data, but actually the experience discomfort was mine as well. And I think what I mean by that is I'm just hopeful that our national experts will challenge us a bit, right? We've all been talking about the things that we think and say, and we want to do this, we want to do that. I hope and invite, if you're listening as you're waiting to speak, right, that you'll say, actually, wait, there's a bit you've got all wrong, and here's why, and for us to just engage with that, because I think that's part of the value of the discussion. So thank you. Let's see who hasn't gone. I will pass it to board member Sandman, to Jim.
Thanks, Nick. Like Michelle, I'm in the believing and acting segments of the compass. I believe that a good education is an important determinant of good life outcomes. I believe that every student in the District of Columbia has a right to a good education as a matter of equity and as a matter of justice. I'm in the acting portion of the compass because this is not an academic exercise in the theoretical sense. This is very real, although we're not making any decisions today. This is a prelude to action that we're going to have to take. So I want to be pragmatic about what the ultimate product of our discussion today is. Among the agreements, I'd emphasize speak your truth. The issues we're about to discuss are hard, and I think it's important that we be candid and honest with each other.
Thank you, board members, for checking in this way. I think it definitely centers our conversation and helps us all understand how we are entering this space. I do want to make a point of noting that no one named staying engaged, because this is a very engaged and active board, and I don't think that that is going to be challenging for any of our board members. But I heard a lot of thinking, a lot of feeling, and also acting and believing. So we are well represented on the compass, and I think we have called each other into leaning into each of our agreements. At this point, I want to just remind us of the meeting norms that we have listed here, and as much as possible for us to stay focused on the discussion, which this is designed to be. And so I am excited now to shift to introducing our guest. We have two national experts with us today. We have Dr. Karika Rausch and Dr. Brian Gill. Dr. Rausch brings more than 23 years of experience as a policy expert, charter school authorizer, and researcher, and he is currently serving as President and CEO of the National Association of Charter School Authorizers, also known as NACSA. We also have with us Dr. Brian Gill, who is one of the nation's leading experts on the effects of charter schools and accountability regimes in education. And I am excited to have both of them there. As you well know, Dr. Gill, who is the director of the Regional Education Laboratory Mid-Atlantic, has worked with us along the way in developing our accountability framework and advising along the way. So they are both wonderful additions to this conversation today, and I'm excited to get to hearing them talk. I want to share just a few more contextual slides before we invite Kirsten James to present and also speak to some of the questions that we have for our experts. So first, I believe that we spent some time on this at our first roundtable, but I wanted to voice over again our theory of action for our revised accountability framework. As board members know, performance frameworks are the accountability mechanism at the center of the charter school authorizer relationship. And this is really a tool along with the 4 other tools that we have as we look at our oversight functions. Particularly, we have endeavored to revise the accountability framework to support our overall vision that every DC student receives a quality education that makes them feel valued and prepares them for lifelong learning, fulfilling careers, and economic security. And we fundamentally believe that schools should produce equitable outcomes for all students, ensuring that students from historically marginalized groups receive a quality education. So as we looked at our performance management framework, we realized that it was not designed to consider student group performance in a way that would illuminate and help us target our efforts toward our new vision. And so in order to facilitate this expectation, we are looking to our revised accountability framework to include more visibility on students who are furthest from opportunity, reporting disaggregated student performance by race and ethnicity, having more distinction between the levels of performance across schools, and that is where we will spend our time this evening talking about what that could look like. We also want to ensure that there's an increased bar for proficiency and that there's a greater emphasis on growth in response to the impact of the pandemic. Next slide, please. What we're hoping with the changes to this framework is that schools, support systems, and partners will have more visibility both to the bright spots as well as areas where intervention is needed, and that resources will be marshaled to help schools improve over time. We are clear that it's not our role as an authorizer to deliver direct improvement supports to LEAs, but I have, and board members as well, have continued to advocate for that kind of support in our education ecosystem. I think you've heard me talk about the resources that are available in New York City through the Charter Resource Center, and I've begun conversations and will continue to have conversations about what's possible in the DC area to provide that same type of support for our schools as we get greater visibility into performance, both bright spots and challenges. And lastly, I'll say that we have learned from the pandemic and we are still learning. And so this work is ongoing. We are focused on producing a high quality framework right now, but we know that we will continue to reflect and iterate and continually improve on our performance frameworks so that they continue to focus on equity and position us to have better insights into student performance. Next slide, please. I want to spend some time just talking about the guiding and design principles behind the framework. It is our hope that the framework is designed, understood, and embraced in such a way that eventually the majority of our schools will adopt it as its goals, similar to what we currently have with our performance management framework. You'll see here that we have examined and considered multiple perspectives. We've wanted to make sure that we have increased visibility on the things that matter the most. We want to make sure that we have a more rigorous framework than the PMF, but we will continue to be focused on having a very research-informed and technically sustainable tool. And as we think about the guiding principles, I think you will find that today's conversation is going to challenge us the most with our design, a guiding principle of rigorous yet attainable. And so you'll hear our national experts give us some feedback and guidance on how we stay true to that particular design principle. So at this moment, I will turn it over to Kirsten. I did speak to the slide that we have here, but I will turn it over to Kirsten to walk us through some of the considerations that we have with regard to levels performance in our framework and to invite our experts to engage in that conversation. So Kirsten James, turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. My name is Kirsten James. I'm a director in the School Performance Department. I am also in the believing space on the Compass. This work consistently pushes me to think about what I believe about public education and school accountability. I'm leaning into also, like many of you, the expect and accept non-closure agreement. I really enjoyed our last conversation, but I know how limited we are on time. Thank you again to Dr. Gill and Dr. Rausch for joining us and bringing your expertise to this conversation. Next slide. Okay. In a recent blog post about accountability, subgroup performance, and Bayesian stabilization, Dr. Gill and his co-authors said this: accountability should be illuminating, helping us understand where and how we need to improve, but our flashlight doesn't shine a light on everything we need it to. In an effort to adjust our accountability flashlight, we are proposing that the revised accountability framework shift from the PMF's 3 tiers to 5 levels. Today's conversation will center on performance levels and this shift. Let me start by saying a brief disclaimer. The information in this graphic is based on the 100 points of the pre-K to 8 PMF. I say that so you generally understand the points possible in each category. But this graphic is so helpful, in illustrating one of the outcomes and challenges of having a 3-tier system. A school with a PMF score of 35.5 and a school with a PMF score of 63.7 both earned tier 2 status. Aside from that being a wide range for the summative score, you'll see that the difference in PARCC proficiency rates could be and has been as much as more than 20 percentage points in ELA. And in math, one school could have double the percentage of proficient students. This means we can't make any generalizations about these schools based on sharing the same tier designation. DC-PCSB is attempting to balance rigor with attainability by shifting to 5 performance levels, allowing for a more granular and reliable performance classification. We acknowledge this would require renorming what each level means. Currently, tier 1 is deemed high performing, tier 2 is mid performing, and tier 3 is low performing. And the policies requiring tier 1 status or a minimum PMF score as the standard for approval would be revised. I want to start by asking a couple of questions of our experts. Dr. Rausch, you first. Does NACSA have any guidance regarding levels and thresholds? And can you speak to any best practices from other authorizers?
Happy to, and really good to see you all. Nice to see you again, Chairman Cruzy, and other board members that I haven't had a chance to meet, and including Board Member Wright, who I just met earlier today, which was fantastic, and always good to see you as well, Dr. Walker Davis. I'm grateful to be here with you all to talk about things that are complex but really important to get right. And so as I've been thinking about this, what I thought might be useful and kind of responding to this question is to make sure that you all as board members understand the trade-offs and kind of context that your accountability sits in at a national level. because I do think it's important, as one of the board members said earlier, right, is to think about maybe some things that you either have thought about or haven't thought about, and to provide a kind of context for you. So within the accountability system, trade-offs are always involved, and it's really important to make sure that you've thought about, and engaged in those trade-offs to inform your decision making. So just give a couple of minutes just on the context in this, and speak specifically about what we see nationally from like a tiering or leveling system. So what we see in the field of authorizing today are really three approaches towards thinking about accountability systems. One approach is not to use tiers or levels at all. We see that amongst some authorizers, including those that have larger portfolios, and some that do have some really high performing portfolios. Essentially what they do is they provide a rating for each indicator on their performance framework each year, and then they make those ratings public. But they don't then categorize or group schools. They evaluate, right, the body of evidence against clear and transparent standards when a school is seeking to grow and replicate, and during kind of the renewal season. Now, authorizers that engage in that kind of a system do so on purpose, right? They believe that there should be clear and transparent criteria, but also to allow for professional judgment in making higher stakes decisions. And so they let each individual school's data stand on their own, and they let the data speak, not necessarily the categories. Now, the trade-offs in that kind of a system are the ability for really competent, thoughtful authorizers to make evidence-informed decisions without being artificially constrained by categories. They're able to treat schools fairly, but not the same. At the same time, that kind of a system opens an authorizer up for criticism of not treating schools similarly, and raises questions of potential bias or favoritism without some kind of a grouping system. It also may be more difficult for stakeholders to know if a school is good or not. So that's kind of one approach that a number of authorizers are using. A second approach, similar to what we're talking about here in DC, is the categorization system. So usually in this system, there's usually some kind of a points that are attached to school performance that add up to some total. And those totals usually translate into benefits and consequences. So the trade-offs of that kind of a system are that it does avoid kind of perceptions of unequal treatment for individual schools. If there are consequences, et cetera, attached to kind of different levels, right? It's really clear from the outset what those are. It also does lead to some constraints in decision-making. In that there are some trade-offs around if you've got a school that's right on the edge of something, of one of these kind of levels or tiers. But if it's pretty clear that if you're in the tier, there are certain benefits and consequences, there can be some artificial constraint around authorizing decision-making in that kind of a model. And that kind of a category system is only as good as the underlying data and approach that puts schools in that categories. As a researcher, right, bad data in, you're going to get bad, information out, right? And so if the underlying system isn't really sound, then you're going to get schools in categories that may not make a whole lot of sense and may lack some credibility for folks generally in the field. The third approach, and then I'll say just maybe a minute on kind of moving from 3 to 5, right, is that it's kind of a combination of the first two that's kind of being used in the field right now. So they rate schools on, all of the indicators of performance framework, but then they don't tier or classify them. But they have more of an informal method of talking to schools about their performance each year. Now, so there's some authorizers that have really systematized that right internally. They'll say, if a school has multiple does not meet standard ratings, then they will tell them you're not eligible for expansion or replication, right? While others may use it more as a way of targeting accountability resources, right? So a school that has kind of all of meet standard or exceed standard, maybe their accountability team will only meet with that school's management team every other month instead of every month, right? Or some other way where they differentiate accountability in that kind of space. So the trade-offs in that approach, again, the ability of the authorizer to make evidence-informed decisions and judgments while still having a method to systematically talk to schools about their performance. But it can certainly lead to the same criticisms that we previously talked about with fairness and how schools are treated. So without getting into like the underlying data weeds and you're thinking about this kind of moving from 3 to 5. So conceptually, right, moving from 3 to 5, it will make your system more complex, right? And thus it will make it more difficult for some key stakeholders to understand. And I would imagine there are going to be some questions to work through externally around, like what's the meaning of the difference, especially in the middle areas, right? So it's like a practical perceptual difference between being in that third group versus the second group, or in that third group versus the fourth group, right? Some questions kind of work through there. The other, I think, more positive trade-off to what you're talking about from 3 to 5 is it will allow you to make some more fine-grade assessments of schools and the kinds of attention and resources that you may wish to devote. Right. So, for example, differentiating schools between group 4 and group 5 may allow you to make some different decisions, right, on how you engage those kind of schools to make your processes more efficient and your resource and attention allocation more streamlined. So I wanted to, just provide you with kind of a national context around how a lot of folks in the field are thinking about this, and also to give you some information around how moving from 3 to 5, right, it could be one approach. There are also other approaches in the field right now, so that you have kind of a sense of where what you're doing is conceptualized in the larger kind of authorizing space.
It might be helpful to pause right here and see if board members have any questions for Dr. Rausch before Kirsten continues.
I do, Dr. Rausch.
Go right ahead.
Can you share a little bit more about the third option? Like where you said, like there's the combo of the two. Can you talk a little bit more about what that actually looks like in practice for some of these authorizers?
Absolutely. And I can speak to this from personal experience. I was an authorizer for the Indianapolis mayor's office for 5 years. This was kind of the approach that we used. So in our performance framework, I think at the time we had maybe 6 academic indicators, maybe 5 or 6 financial indicators, and maybe 6 or 7 operational or organizational performance indicators. And every year we gave schools a rating for each of those, right? So for each of the 5 academic, indicators, right, for growth, for proficiency, for college and career readiness, right, we'd give them a rating of exceed standard, meet standard, approaching standard, and then does not meet standard was kind of our system. And then what we did is every year, right, we provided all that information for every school, again, to let kind of their data speak. But what we then had was it was a pretty systemized, right, system where we'd meet with schools on a monthly basis. And then once we had our kind of indicators and ratings that came out, right, we had a system where if you had a does not meet standard, for example, in any of your academic ratings, don't even ask, right, to grow or to replicate or expand, right? Because that just, you didn't show a readiness there. And then we had a system where we would have, if you had multiple organizational indicators that were problematic, but then we especially wanted to have important professional judgment to make determinations on schools that may want to replicate or expand during renewal season, where they may have a couple of approaching standard ratings, right? Where if we would have had kind of a categorization system, it may have been more complicated to say, well, yeah, this school is in this area, but we still think the right approach is for them to move forward with renewal or not. We were able to use the body of evidence, right, in making those kind of determinations and evidence-based informed decision around what would happen next. Does that answer your question, Board Member Wright?
It does. It does. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Rausch, it's so lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us today and for this presentation. My question is mindful that authorizing contexts vary so much in different parts of the country, and that in many environments, LEAs have the opportunity to select among authorizers and kind of look at different approaches that authorizers may have in holding schools accountable. In our context here, we are in a moment where we're looking at student performance and recognizing that there isn't that the potential of students in DC are not at a place where we feel the performance of our LEAs is in a place where students are able to live out the vision that we have for our city, so that every student is in a high quality learning environment, so that they're going to be on a path for lifelong learning, fulfilling careers, economic security. And that the role of the unique governance model of a charter school enables an LEA to have autonomy in exchange for that accountability. And so this revised accountability framework is in that context of this goal of improving student learning outcomes. From what you've observed, and perhaps from your own experience, how have knowing that the role of the external pressure that that a summative rating can have, how have authorizers responded to and deployed a different kind of frame, the 3 different approaches to that end? Or do you feel that in those kinds of environments, those authorizers have a different vision or objective that they are working toward?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. And I would say, and the examples that I gave are examples kind of in the fields that really high quality authorizers are using right now, right? Meaning that they do absolutely have a vision towards improved student outcomes. I mean, that's the name of the game. Although it's not a game, because we're talking about kids' lives here. But the work, right, that authorizing is engaging in must be towards that end. What I would say is that a lot of the ability for an authorizer to implement changes to their system has an awful lot to do with the level of trust that they've been able to develop with many stakeholders, including schools themselves, in the work and in the field, and a lot with how they communicate intentions and how they go about rolling out changes. And I would say like those 3 things matter an awful lot. Where there is a high degree of trust, schools, especially high performing schools, will be with you and should be right people who will be, even if it's a small group, right, vocal proponents of saying, yes, this is good and right for kids because we're going to get better results. The ability to talk about the why behind what you're doing it in a compelling way matters an awful lot. And not just speaking like it's important to be in like plain spoken language around here's what we're facing and here's what we're trying to get to. I would say the third thing that we've learned from authorizers implementing changes to our accountability system is much better to go slow and get it right than to go fast and get it wrong. So not uncommon for authorizers making changes to their systems to take not only their time in kind of developing the system, right, but then maybe it's a year or 2 of making sure schools know what their, if it's a categorization system, how they would, kind of look on this new system, right, for a period of time, while, right, not making it like official, right, or public, right, for a period of time. Again, and that is more of a function of letting schools adjust and like the shock of a school saying, right, we were doing pretty good, but now we're not, right, can create credibility questions that can be avoided, right, in situations where you're thoughtful and engaging in the process. Does that answer your question, Chairperson Cruzy?
It does. Thank you. And I recognize that I took us a little bit off the 3 tiers.
I see Vice Chair Sandman's hand up and also Board Member Rodriguez. So why don't you go first, Jim, and then Nick.
Thank you. I think that the data that a charter authorizer collects is ultimately put to 2 uses. The first is used by the charter authorizer itself to make decisions about the LEAs, to decide whether to renew a charter, whether to revoke a charter, whether to permit an enrollment ceiling increase. The other use is used by the public that the charter authorizer exists to serve, to provide useful, understandable information to them in selecting schools. When you described the first option, simply putting all the data out there, not trying to categorize or group schools, you said there are some charter authorizers that do that. I can imagine that could work for the first use to which the data are put. That is the charter authorizer, which I hope would be sophisticated in its understanding and interpretation of the data, would have the experience and the expertise to be able to make sense of all that data without needing to categorize it. But when it comes to the other use, the use by the public, by the families who are making decisions about schools, I think it could be much more complicated. It's information overload. It looks transparent. It is transparent, but how useful is it? Can you talk about your views on how to balance those two different purposes for which data are collected and used?
Absolutely. And it's a fantastic question, and I'll be brief. Yes, there could be some advantages to taking a lot of information and making sense of it, for families. But what we found in kind of across the country is one, families are fairly sophisticated in the information that they are getting, and two, sometimes the things that families are looking for are a part of authorizer accountability systems, but there are also other things that help to influence, right, families making that ultimate choice, right? So one of the things we've never recommended in a school's accountability system, right, is the degree to which they provide transportation, or what their after-school programs are, or activities, or if they provide before or after school care. Those things are hugely consequential in families making determinations. Now, one of the things that we do think it's responsible of an authorizer to do is to absolutely make sure that they are providing enough helpful information for families and making right, thoughtful, and smart choices. And there are some benefits, right, towards being able to group those together. But I wouldn't necessarily say that kind of a category system versus a let the data speak system is necessarily better or worse for families. I think it really depends on what each individual family is looking for and the information they're looking to gather in that. The last thing I'll say is one of the things that we did in Indianapolis, again, with our kind of approach and other authorizers, including Massachusetts and SUNY and others, right, of some consequence, is, they'll also provide like a color to their rating system. And so when you look at in the one pager, right, if you see a whole lot of red, that's not necessarily a great school. You see a whole lot of blue or green, that gives us more information that can be helpful or useful.
Can I ask a quick follow-up? We're not writing on a clean slate here. We're not starting from scratch. We already have a system that tiers schools. So if we were to change it and go to a system that doesn't tier schools, the perception in the community could be that we've taken a useful tool away. Have you seen charter authorizers that have gone from a tiered system, a categorical system, to a system where they simply put all the data out there? And if so, how did that play?
Yeah, it's a great question. I have not seen one go from kind of a category tiering system to a kind of let the data speak system. Usually authorizers that are in each of those kind of three buckets are there for like philosophical purposes, and you don't see a whole lot of switching, kind of between those three approaches. But what I would offer, right, in the spirit of right going from 3 to 5, is there are trade-offs, right, associated with that. And again, I'm not making a recommendation that y'all should just scrap the system and go to something different, right? You may wish to engage right at that, but I want to provide that as context so you know kind of where you kind of are fit in this space. But what I would say is going from 3 to 5. Again, the trade-offs that I would say, if that's the space you guys elect to move into, right, is are we comfortable with the trade-offs of more complexity that may be, it'll be more complex than what families and schools are currently used to, right, versus a more fine-grained understanding to kind of target resources and opportunities for. I think those are the trade-offs that you're working through and moving conceptually from 3 to 5.
Thank you.
Nick, you want to ask your question? And then I would like to invite Dr. Gill into the conversation as well.
Yes, and sorry, yeah. Okay, two quick ones. One, you mentioned earlier the 5 tiers can be more confusing than 3, but is it, one thing I'm wondering is, even just looking at your graphic, can it be clearer and more understandable if it simply says it's pretty evenly divided, that's what it means? Or do you feel like there's just an inherent additional confusion or complexity that comes from more tiers?
Yeah, and so it's a great question. I don't think it's necessarily a function of more tiers, but to the questions we were talking about before, you're also not writing from a clean slate, right? Everybody knows, right, in DC, right, the 3-tier system, right? People know that. And so moving from 3 to 5, I wouldn't say it's more confusing, but it is going to provide more complexity, right, for folks. And there will be some challenges associated, right, with that trade-off.
Great, excellent. And the second question is perhaps a little bit for you, a little bit for Kirsten. And it's just maybe you mentioned something else about categories versus not categories and how those are for decision making or discretion. But I'm wondering, as I look at the decisions this board makes, it's not clear to me that the majority of them turn on the tier a school is in. More often than not, I look at criteria, I look at principles, and they're almost always based on cut points around the underlying data. We were just talking, we spent a lot of time last night talking about a survey percentage response rate. We talk about things like, what's your sort of overall score? Even within the PMF, we just have a score goal sometimes when someone sets the PMF as goal. Kirsten, I wonder how many, would you agree that the majority of the decisions we make actually turn on the underlying data rather than on the category a school is in?
It depends.
Yeah.
Previously with the PMF, we did have policies that spoke directly to a school can do XYZ if they are tier 1, period.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
Or a school can do XYZ if they have a PMF score of blank. And a school that's a PMF school meets their goals if they've met or exceeded X benchmark of their summative score, right? And so usually that is the case, right? It's like it matters what your tier or your score is. And I will say though, I think that in this time where we've been in between accountability systems, where we've had to look at additional data for schools, it has pushed us to look more closely at specific data points that we might have available when we had no data available. And so we couldn't give summative scores for the PMF. So we had to look at what was their park performance or what was, and so we looked more closely at those things. I will say also though, the conversation that happened last night was specific to a school that has individually negotiated goals. And so we are talking about a standard of rigor for those types of goals when a school is setting its own goals versus what we're talking about here in terms of standardizing the framework for all schools.
And I'll just jump in and say that I ditto to what Kirsten said, but also we have done both. There are, particularly around reviews and review time, there is opportunity for the board to exercise discretion where the board can look at underlying data more discreetly. And as Dr. Roush said, use professional judgment, particularly if a school is approaching, particularly around conversations about improvement over time. And so I think you are right, Nick, that we do look both at the level or tier previously, but we look at summative performance. And even there's a potential as we look at the new accountability framework to look at the language that we use for category performance, meaning proficiency or progress, school achievement, progress, or school environment. There's an opportunity to look at the category performance in our framework in addition to any particular level that a school might land in with a summative score. So that's an opportunity that we haven't fully explored because we don't yet have the new framework, but could explore and allow more flexibility than just saying you're in 1, you're in 5, you get to do this, you don't get to do that.
Yeah. One quick comment on that is simply to say that I wonder if it doesn't have to be that nothing depends on the tier you're in, right? But if fewer things do and there's discretion, it strikes me that tells us for Jim's first purpose of what actually happens with an LEA, we're being nuanced and deliberative and using all the available information, but we're preserving the ability to communicate clearly about what's going on by having 5 tiers, right? But we do that by not attaching sort of unmodifiable stakes to each of the tiers, essentially. I think that, and it feels as if that's how we've operated in the past, and how we might want to operate in the future.
I was going to bring Dr. Gill into the conversation here because I know he has something to say about this. And if you could share your thoughts or insight about, from a research standpoint point or otherwise about shifting from 3 to 5 levels?
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten. And thank you, Dr. Walker Davis, and to all the members of the board for the invitation to participate today. This has been a great conversation, I should say. And I think people are illuminating lots of interesting points and some, as Dr. Roush said, some trade-offs. So a few thoughts. First, as a technical matter for, issues related to reliability of the measures, I would say that 5 ratings are certainly justifiable if you look at the research on true variation in school performance, both in DC and across the country. Schools vary widely in performance, and they vary in ways that would go beyond what 3 categories can give you. In addition, I would say it's likely that the particular measures you're using to produce an overall rating are giving you something that is likely to be reliable enough to make meaningful distinctions in 5 categories rather than just 3. So this is partly related to the example that Kirsten gave at the beginning, where with only 3 categories, you end up putting in the same category schools where the performance is really quite different, right? So that's the first thing I would say. I think there's probably, and I know Kirsten and colleagues at PCSB have done some modeling to look at some reliability issues. You could look at that more carefully if you want, just to develop more confidence in the reliability of a 5 category system. But I'm pretty sure you would end up with something that works there. Then I would say that the key question about the number of rating categories is, what do you want the information to inform? So this is related to Vice Chair Sandman's point about the uses of the ratings. If you want schools and families to respond differently at the high and low ends of the scale in particular, then that's a good reason to expand the categories. If you want to incentivize schools to aim higher, it makes sense to have ratings that include some levels that are maybe more demanding than what you've had in the past. So I would say, all of that suggests that to me that I don't see any major problems with switching from 3 ratings to 5. However, it is important to recognize that the overall rating doesn't actually, whether it's 3 categories or 5, the overall rating doesn't provide clear guidance about what a school should do, or I would argue about what families should do, because it combines a lot of different kinds of measures, right? A school that ends up in the lowest category because it has very low proficiency rates needs something different than a school that ends up in the lower category because it has very low growth rates. And so it's essential to look beyond the overall rating to the components, which is consistent with what Board Member Rodriguez was just saying, and also consistent with the kind of system that Dr. Roush described in Indianapolis, where you're looking at components and elements separately. I think that now, that said, I'm sympathetic to the concern that I think I've heard about making things too complicated, particularly for families, that there's value in some simplicity here. And but I would argue that you can take an intermediate approach that is sort of something in between the system of, I forget how many elements it was that Dr. Roush described in Indianapolis. It sounded like it was about 15 or 20 in total. Something in between that and a single rating. And to do that, you would categorize the various elements into a small number of categories. Well, it turns out you've already been doing that, right? You have a set of categories, as Dr. Walker Davis just said, related to achievement and progress and environment, right? And
happily, that set of categories is remarkably consistent with a framework that we recently proposed in School Administrator Magazine a few months ago, which is that to get a fairly comprehensive set of measures of school performance, you would like measures, we described it as related to impacts, outcomes, and processes, and which are pretty directly analogous impacts to progress, outcomes to achievement, and processes to environment. So very, very similar to the categories that you have in mind. The point is, for the purposes of informing families, you could create a system that has a single measure for each of those three categories, where each one is based on rolling up multiple different measures, but you're rolling up measures that only to the extent that what you end up with is fairly coherent. It's telling you something that is actually useful about the school's performance and where the challenges are and where the successes are. And I think that's the sort of thing that would be more useful to schools, would be more useful to the board's decision-making, and would also be more useful to families, because families ultimately need to know how is any particular school, how well is it going to serve my child, right? And from that perspective, growth is probably the single most important thing they need to know. And so being able to distinguish a school that has high growth from a school that maybe has a high proficiency rate just because it happens to be, say, in an area of DC where it ends up serving kids who are more advantaged to begin with, right? As a parent, you need to know, well, look, that school has high proficiency, but it doesn't mean it's actually growing its kids. And I want my kid in a school that's going to grow my kid's achievement, right? So I think there's a way to sort of thread these needles to produce something that provides useful diagnostic information for all of the relevant decision makers, and gives you something that can be viewed as reliable and in fact, in many respects, not, it also recognizably derived from the system you've had in place too, even though it'll be different in important respects as well. So let me stop there. That was a long statement. Happy to answer any questions anybody might have.
I see a lot of thinking faces, so let me see if there are any immediate questions for Dr. Gill, and then I will do my best to summarize what I've heard thus far before moving us on. So questions for Dr. Gill.
Right, very brief one. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Gill. There's an analogy that popped into my head as I listened to you, which is may not be a great one. So let's not actually use it, but just for the purposes of the discussion. It's when you get your credit score and you see a number, it's one number, but then you see in a panel underneath it says positive factors affecting your score and then negative factors affecting your score. Is that kind of what one aspect of what you have in mind, this idea of, yes, there's a number or a category or whatever, but we're trying to dig under that, the nuance. What are the components where the school has its greatest strengths? What are the components where the school has its greatest challenges? Things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in particular, when there's a question about how much do you want to combine, right? And I think you could choose to ultimately produce some overall rating as long as you were very careful in telling folks, look, you need to look under the hood to at least these different types of ratings to get a sense of why a school ended up there. What are those factors positively contributing or negatively contributing to the overall rating? And the alternative approach would be to say, maybe you produce 5 tiers for each of 3 different categories, and you don't produce an overall rating. I think either of those ways would be defensible, but I do think that if you're going to produce something that is a combination of growth and achievement and environment, then it's really critical to also publicize those three separate categories, because otherwise it's impossible to know what contributed to that result.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Brian. I'm thinking about the studies that I've read about taking education alongside other domains in our lives where summative ratings are used, and the value of 3 versus 4 versus 5, and maybe a less charged an analog might be like a restaurant rating, and we'll indulge in thinking about a Michelin rating, right? So that's obviously going to be a compendium of multiple dimensions. A restaurant that has excellent food but terrible service is not going to get a top rating. And yet summative ratings exist. And it is more valuable to have a meaningful rating system so that diners or critics or whomever, public health officials, can make informed regulatory decisions. Let's use the analogy of us as public health officials. There may be excellent food, but if that restaurant is not clean, that is not a restaurant that public health regulators should be allowing to stay open. Or a restaurant that has whatever, you can take the metaphor however long you want to make. But my point is that I have read studies that where districts or authorizers or whatever decision-making body in the case back in education have had summative ratings and have softened them, student performance has dropped. And that the external pressure of having them has been uncomfortable at times, particularly for schools having to stretch and work towards ambitious outcomes, but has actually led to increased student performance. When we started this exercise a few years ago, we were pretty clear that there's a number of ways in which families can make informed school choice decisions in DC. And that because the accountability system that this body uses this body only has authority over public charter schools, not over all public schools in DC, for example. And to a point, I think Dr. Rausch made earlier, that parents make choices based on lots of information that may have in a Venn diagram overlap largely, but perhaps not entirely, with the decisions that this board needs to make when we are thinking about review and renewal decisions, expansion decisions, and so on and so forth. And so I'm mindful that with some of these other examples, what are we working toward may vary. And I asked the question around what other authorizers are working toward. This group has worked really hard at continuing to understand the opportunity for the sector to improve student performance coming out of the pandemic, because as a result of our strategic roadmap work and the revised vision and mission that we have for what we believe is possible and what students of DC deserve. And so for me, this is kind of nested in what we are working toward. And so I go back to the 3 versus 5 and the value of a rating system at all to drive student achievement.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to think about it. I mean, you want to keep the long-term goals in mind all the time. I think the restaurant analogy is a very interesting one because it is similar in some respects to the schools, but it's also importantly different in other respects. In particular, in the case of the restaurant, the overall summative rating, so yes, it includes multiple components in the same way the school rating does. But in the case of the restaurant, you could argue, I think reasonably, that all of the components, service and food quality, say, are under the restaurant's control entirely. That is, the restaurant gets to pick its own ingredients, right? And it gets to pick its own staff, and in particular, the ingredients. Whereas in the case of schools, you're trying to serve all the kids in DC, no matter what advantages or disadvantages they might have outside of the school's control, right? And so when you're looking at incentivizing long-term improvement, you want to be careful that by saying we have a high target for proficiency, that doesn't cause schools to say, okay, we're going to try to find the smartest kids, right? And we're going to try to discourage the kids, say, with learning disabilities, or the kids who are otherwise low achieving beforehand. We're going to try to discourage them from enrolling here because they're going to lower our proficiency rate. Instead, you want to make sure that, I think, that the schools know that they need to promote the achievement growth of all the students they serve, and that they shouldn't have an incentive to serve one particular kind of student rather than a different kind of student, especially if that means, if the incentive pushes them to just, try to enroll high achievers. So I would argue that from the perspective of creating those incentives and setting the long-term goals, that a set of 3 different tiers, where one tier is about proficiency and achievement, one is about growth or impact or value added, or promotion power, is a phrase we came up with where we looked at the impact of DC high schools on the likelihood that a student would graduate, the likelihood they would enroll in college, that sort of thing. Not just the raw outcome, but the effect of the school on increasing their likelihood of longer term success. That, making clear to the schools that they should be maximizing the opportunities of the students they serve, is the way to do that, if that makes sense.
Okay, I am going to try to move us along. I heard a few things. One, I heard that there are multiple approaches in the field to how charter authorizers develop rating systems, and typically, given that we're not starting from scratch, like other authorizers, they choose a particular philosophy and make adjustments according to that philosophy. I heard that any of the choices that we make, there are trade-offs to it, and we always need to be paying attention to how simple or complex our system is to digest, both for LEAs and other stakeholders. With respect to the number of levels, there is some value in looking at more granular levels from 3 to 5, both to reflect what we know is the variation in school performance measures, and as long as we can ensure reliability of those 5 levels, that might be a way of getting at that level of granularity. I heard that there are some considerations that we need to make about having an overall summative score and the uses of that summative score, either if that is something that we have knowledge and can make professional judgment on internally, or how much of that needs to be communicated externally, and that there is value in also looking at what's beneath that summative score, paying attention to the pieces that inform that, or what we have been thinking about, which is our categories of achievement, progress, and environment, and whether there is value in sharing information about schools' performance on those particular categories, in addition to or instead of any particular levels. So I think those are all of the considerations that I heard, lots underneath each of those, but wanted to just summarize that before we move on to some more specific, additional specific questions that Kirsten and the team and I have. So Kirsten, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Such a good conversation. So this is a heavy one. I just want to prepare you. We are going to talk about setting thresholds. So there are 3 options, or we are providing 3 options for level thresholds. And And these are the three that we use during modeling. One might think that having 5 levels automatically translates to 20-point score ranges. You'll see that's option X. Option Y is an attempt at maintaining rigor by raising the bar, but ensuring that achieving levels 1 and 2 is attainable. Option Z takes that a bit further with adjustments to cut scores across all the levels. Dr. Gill, can you quickly tell us how cut scores are normally established and if it matters whether or not the cut scores are equal or the score ranges are equal or not?
So I don't think that technically there's any reason that you have to make the score ranges equal. You've got a whole lot of different measures that go into these percentages ultimately. And I think, what you've been doing in modeling how this might have come out hypothetically if you had a system like this in place in past years is exactly the right thing to do. That what's important is, well, what does the distribution of schools across the measures look like? And that, if the key aim in moving from 3 categories to 5 is to have greater differentiation of performance, if another key aim is to set a high expectation at the high end, then you want to set the thresholds in a way that produces a good bit of differentiation across the ratings and that doesn't put too many at the top, because you're hoping that you're going to encourage more schools to get there in the future.
Okay, thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so option X, and that mistakenly says option Z. This chart shows the distribution of pre-K to 12 schools when applying option X's cut scores using the current model and school year 21-22 data. Adult schools were not included due to a lack of data availability. As you can see, there are no level 5 schools. Most schools fall into levels 3 and 4, and there are only 2 schools in level 1. One might say this approach is more rigorous than attainable. I have a question for the board members. How do you feel about a framework or these thresholds where there are only 2 schools that have earned level 1? You feel nothing?
So I've said this before in some of these discussions. I think maybe they might not have been board discussions, so apologies for those hearing it for the first time. But in my mind, at least, I'm thinking, the current 3-tier system has existed for some time now, and over time, people react to it, respond to it, they work to improve on it, etc. And I think the distribution shifts. Now, I'm not imagining the same amount of shifting might happen here, but I think you start here, and I imagine I would not anticipate or hope that this is where things would stay, right? The whole point of the system is to encourage improvement and climbing of the ladder of the tiers, as it were. So for my part, I'm comfortable with it. Obviously, there's other things you got to look into, but in general, I don't have an objection on its face to the idea that the starting point is, there's only a few that are in the very first level.
Other thoughts? And then I have a question for Dr. Rausch.
I agree with Nick. I can't answer the question without knowing what the criteria are, though. And I'm curious about what we mean by attainable. When I think about attainable, I'm influenced by our strong belief that every student, including students from marginalized backgrounds, is capable of achieving. So I don't know what an unattainable goal would be. The fact that some might look at this and say, if only 2 schools are in level 1, that's unattainable. I don't agree with that. I'd want to know more about what the criteria are for level one, what the descriptor is that's attached to level one. But to answer the question that you put directly, no, I'm not offended by the fact that only 2 schools might end up in level one.
So for
Yeah,
right
I would-
now, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, Board Member Wright.
Yeah, I think part of the pause was a combination of both what Nick and Jim said. One, it's hard without understanding the full measures. I mean, I don't think anyone would look and say, oh, I'm satisfied with only having 2 of our schools be top performing schools. That's not it. But that also doesn't mean that you lower the bar and change the bar to make more schools reach that high level, right? So I think for me, it really is understanding the metrics behind it and what makes it up. And then I do agree to some extent, and remember, I come with the identity of a school leader that was impacted, right? We did not have PMF, and then we got PMF. And I watched, as Nick said, I watched the bands change and people move and work towards it, which is why I also think it is very important that this framework is right, because that is exactly what folks will be striving for. And if it's the wrong measure, children suffer. But I'm going to come back to what you asked me about here, Kirsten. So my hesitation, I want to answer it to say, no, I'm not satisfied with that. But I do expect that there would be some reckoning of, under any of these 3 options, some reckoning of how schools would fall as folks got used to the measures. But I'd want to know what makes up each of those ahead of time, and would not want to make a decision based solely off of data falling in terms of choosing how we broke the ranges up.
If I might maybe ask the same question differently, all of this is informed by all of the measures and metrics that will be in the framework that will roll up into a summative score. And essentially with this equal distribution, we're saying, do we believe that the schools that perform 80% to 100% on our framework are the ones that should be in level one versus the schools that are somewhere between 20% and 40% on our framework? And there is a sort of philosophical approach to how much is the right amount of performance to get you into each of these categories. And I think Board Member Vice Chair Sandman talked about how we describe the levels. That is coming. We are going to have a conversation about that yet this evening. But I think the options that we have in front of us, the conversation about what is attainable and what is rigorous is relative to where we know schools are starting right now. Right. So I believe what Jim believes, that our work is to get every student to reach their highest potential, and that it is possible. But if we think about what is that work from where we are today to where we ultimately will get, that is where you have a conversation about what is attainable over what period of time is really probably the more appropriate way to say that. And so I think maybe, Kirsten, it might be helpful to just show what some of those trade-offs are if we look at the other options that are in front of us.
Yep, I will. I did want to ask quickly, Dr. Rausch, in your experience or coming from any guidance that NACSA has, what is your position or NACSA's position on defining the highest rating for a performance framework? So like, is it that you've met 80% of the indicators or more, or is that kind of something that's subjective and varies across authorizers?
I can answer that real quickly. It's subjective and varies. And that is in part on purpose. And that is because, right, important to remember what we're talking about here. Mm-hmm. Right. So this is like proportion of goals met, or however you are measuring against your own framework. Right. And that's a really important point here. It's not as if you are measuring an absolute thing that people already understand. You are measuring your framework, right? And how schools are doing against your framework to put them in these categories. So my advice on this, and I think we've seen this in some places that have been, fairly sophisticated, has been the stronger your underlying framework, the more latitude you should provide in each of your categories. right? It would be different, right? If you didn't already have kind of strong underlying ways in which you're assigning points or right and kind of things in your underlying framework. I think that is a strong reason to consider right broader categories. And I'm trying to work really hard right to get away from some of the conversation around higher standards versus lower standards. I don't think that's like part of what we're talking about right here. And that's because, right, if you want to have the highest standard, why not make level 1 95% to 100, right? Or something higher, right, than that, right? Or something lower, right? So this is less right about a conversation around, having high expectations for schools or not. That's what your underlying framework is designed to do. This is designed, right, to try to say, of that framework, how do we want to think about where schools are in this category system? Does that make sense?
Mhm. Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Okay, so this chart shows the distribution of schools when applying option-wise cut scores, also using the current model, school year 21-22 data. With the slight adjustments to the cut scores, the number of schools in levels 1 and 2 have each doubled, and more than 50% of schools are in level 3. And lastly, the distribution of schools when applying the last options, cut scores, also use current model, school year 21-22 data. Nearly all the schools fall into levels 2 and 3. This option has the most schools in level 1 and the least number of schools in level 4. My one consideration here is to the point of, or Dr. Gill's point about distribution, and if all of the schools being kind of grouped in the middle or in a small number of categories provides the actual meaningful distinction that we are looking for. And I'm not sure if that is the case here.
Kirsten, I hear the question that you're asking here, but I actually want to, I've been marinating on what you just said, Dr. Rausch, about measuring against our own framework. That's really intriguing for me, so much so that I'm like, can I just come downstairs and talk to you about that? But I'm wondering, it's like, so what does it say about, this is, I guess, more philosophical, and maybe my own learning and other board members may not have it. What should an authorizer be striving for in terms of distribution of its schools when it is knowing that the rankings do exactly what you said, measure against the framework? Like, so does that mean if you have, say we go back to that option X, where you only have, a few schools at the top, the majority at the bottom, or even the one that Kirsten has up here where the vast are falling, kind of in the middle. What does that say? What does it mean to measure against our own framework, and what should we be striving for? Like, what does that mean from an authorizer standpoint? Do you understand what I'm trying to dig deeper in? Dr. Rausch?
I'm sorry. It's like, so I don't know if we were asking about distribution. I think you wanted for me or Dr. Gill to take that question on distribution. I think the point that I was making is, and this may be a little controversial, but I'll say it anyway. I wouldn't pay as much attention to distribution in your category system as I would what the underlying data tell us about how schools are doing moving forward. Right. And I say that because, again, these percentages here, you can set them wherever you want to set them, right? It's about how well schools are performing on your underlying system that's informing this. Now, if you're intending to use, right, these in ways that, we haven't yet talked about, then, in terms of attaching like lots of consequences, we had a conversation before around, right, it's a combination, right? Maybe tier 1 schools get some things that tier 2 schools don't, but I also heard, yeah, but sometimes we use some of the underlying distribution, right? If it's going to be some combination, then I would say the structure of your distribution, I would be much more inclined, right, to care a lot more about a proportion of kids that have grown enough to be on grade level in 2 years, for example, right, or other elements of your underlying framework than necessarily I would with these. And because I believe your underlying framework has a lot of good important elements that your team has been really thoughtful around how those things kind of categorize, I'd be more inclined to think about a wider distribution than a narrower distribution for this purpose.
Okay. Dr. Gill, do you have a thought about that in terms of like kind of the measuring against our own framework and how schools fall?
Well, I agree with Dr. Roush that, you know, you want to look at how you'd want to look at how the overall ratings here break out in terms of, well, what does it look like for the schools in terms of their progress measures and their proficiency measures and their environment measures. I mean, as a researcher, I tend to have more confidence in things that look like a normal distribution, that typical curve, you know, so you expect to have more in the middle and fewer at the ends. That's usually, for most kinds of things that we measure, that's very often the reality. The first two, I think, had more of, more differentiation and potentially more room for upside improvement than this one does. And so just looking at the scores, just looking at the distribution without knowing anything about the underlying components, I tend to think that one of the first two might be more desirable, but you would want to look at the underlying components to get a better sense of what it actually means in terms of progress and achievement and environment for schools in the different categories.
I would just say what I am taking away from this conversation is we have done the work and we're continuing to do the work on the measures and the components of this framework. And I think the conversation for this conversation and not for decision-making tonight is a philosophical one on how much of the total framework do we think a school needs to meet to be in any of these respective categories, right? And so when I hear we're measuring this against our framework versus other things, it's more of, that's the takeaway that I am having. We said these things matter in our framework, and Kirsten can tell me how many measures we're now looking at, but there are a lot of them that inform this framework. And there is some judgment that we are making that says, if you've met this particular mark, that is, we're going to have a slide on what language we might say, but that represents some level of excellence. And if you haven't, that represents some level of caution where we should be looking at making some other kinds of decisions. And I think that's where the both art and science might come in around how we set those thresholds. And this conversation was really to get board members' perspectives on where you see what advice and counsel you might give us as staff is thinking about this to bring forth a recommendation to you. I will just name that one of the challenges I see in option Z that we're looking at right now is I would wonder how different this really is from where we are right now, in that most of our schools are clumped in the same two levels. The bulk of our schools are at the same two levels of performance, and part of our desire in going to a 5-level system is to get that level of granularity and distinction, particularly in the middle. And so I equally have a concern that at this particular moment, we may not have a lot of schools in our highest level, but I also fundamentally believe that over time that will change and increase. And so those are the two things that I think about when I'm looking at these options. And to Dr. Gill's point, the first two provide more flexibility in making those distinctions at this point, although out the gate, we're not going to have as many schools in the highest level of performance. But we will have a good number in the first two levels of performance, which is important as well.
Yeah. Dr. Walker, that was my first reaction when I looked at this too. I was like, this looks like three tiers in essence. I had that same visceral reaction.
Thank you for that, Dr. Walker Davis. I was going to add in that what we're really talking about is, of the measures that we've identified and the points that are made available, is a school in the highest level when they've gotten 80% of those points that are made available to them, or 70% of those points made available to them. And while I could talk for hours about the mechanics of the actual framework, understanding that most of the measures are based on relative performance to other schools means that we have not set our own benchmarks for excellence. It is based on 10th and 90th percentile, so it's in relation to other schools that are like them, and student group performance. And so with those kind of general understandings of how the math works out, and the assignment of points to the various measures that we have, and our thoughtful assignment of those points, how do these thresholds communicate school quality, right? Like, what is it saying when a school has earned 30% of the available points to them? And does that, and I think also something that's come up for me is that this conversation happens alongside the conversation of, well, what does it mean for a school to be in that level? Are they allowed to XYZ? Are they not allowed to XYZ? So thank you all for such great questions and thoughts. It is really helpful to hear other perspectives about what this could look like and what is helpful.
I think we should move to your descriptions right now.
Great. So the last part of our discussion about performance levels is about using descriptors for each level. The PMF only had numbers, and DC PCSB staff started out with the idea that we might just use descriptors for the 5 levels. In a previous conversation with the board, we heard that using numbers is necessary and preferred. We have been grappling with whether or not the levels should also have descriptors. These are a few options for the level names, and I want to open the floor for any initial reactions, and also talk to Dr. Gill and Dr. Rausch. In your experiences, how kind of level naming or ratings that are that use descriptors have fared. Dr. Rausch, I heard you say that in Indianapolis you had like meeting expectations, approaching meeting, and so on, and whether or not like numbers and levels matter, level names rather.
I feel like I've taken up a lot of airtime, so I'll be super brief on this. First, I'm just going to say I'm going to pray for y'all, because naming these things is a wholly complicated, right, kind of endeavor. And there is actually a reason why those authorizers that do use some kind of categorization system usually don't name them, right? They'll use, like DC has, right, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, because when you start putting words to those things, it starts taking on a whole different meaning. And schools and the public there's a whole different connotation, right, attached to those. So, and so that's why I looked up, right, some examples of folks that, kind of have done this, right? So you look at Denver Public Schools, they don't have names, but they do have colors, right? So they have blue, green, yellow, orange, and red, where blue is great and red is bad. If you look at Colorado Charter Schools Institute, they choose, they take some from the state's nomenclature system and add their own. So their kind of 5 names are performance with distinction, performance, improvement, priority improvement, and turnaround. And then my favorite, which is Novation Education Opportunities, it's an authorized in Minnesota. They have a 3 descriptor system. They've got exemplary performance, satisfactory performance, and candidate for non-renewal is how they've chosen to describe, right, their system. So I would say this may be, amongst all the things y'all are working on, the most complicated because of the way that the public will perceive this. It takes on a whole different connotation than the thoughtful, nuanced discussion we've just been having around levels and going from 3 to 5 and what things can folks do at different levels. I mean, a very important, nuanced conversation. The second you put this kind of a label on it, it means something totally different in the real world.
I'm going to pray for you as your opening lines. I got to say with that, thank you.
So Dr. Roush has more expertise on this issue than I do. I don't have a lot of relevant experience on the particular words. I would say that it seems likely that it might be easier to do this if you're looking at particular elements than if you're trying to do it for an overall rating. Exactly because the overall rating combines so many different things. I think the color solution sounds like it might be a good one. The only thing I want to point out with respect to the numbers, and this is something that Kirsten and I have discussed before, is that there's a potential confusion here because the park assessments that DC uses have rating levels with the scale reversed, right? So in park, the higher score is better and the lower score is worse. And so level, like, is it also 5 in park? I think it is, right? 4? Okay. In any case, the higher number is a better level on park. And so having a system that you call levels with numbers that go in the opposite direction is at least potentially confusing.
Staff, can I ask the reason in terms of the grappling and the desire for the words to accompany, not even addressing Dr. Gills of our reverse kind of number thing, but what was the reason in terms of trying to put some words behind it? I'm just interested into why we would be thinking about that.
Yeah, I can take an initial stab at it. I think one of the reasons is we already knew that there would be some socialization of moving from 3 to 5. And there is meaning attached to tier 1 to tier 3 right now. And we did not want people to just replace that with the same meaning for our 5 levels. And part of it was to move away from any numbers at all and to shift to conveying what we actually think it means to be in each of those categories. And so, but I would agree with Dr. Roush that it's hard. I mean, it took us a long time to think about what are the names that are closest to getting at the spirit of what we think performance at each of those categories would mean. And this does not factor in any particular words that we would use if we were to make some distinctions around the subcategories that inform the framework, like achievement, progress, and environment. But initially it was to make some very distinct departure from our previous way of ranking and identifying schools. So I don't know if you wanted to add anything else that you all looked at, Kirsten, in the working groups.
I would say that I misspoke previously. The PMF had 3 tiers, and there were associated explanations of high performing, mid performing, and low performing to describe the tiers. But generally, folks would say, "What tier are you?" Right? And so, and I think, for one, we did want to make the distinction that level 1 is the highest and level 5 is the lowest, because there are other instances where someone might reference the opposite. And so the words would provide that distinction of level 1 is the exceeding and level 5 is the didn't meet or whatever. And we also talked about like shorthand, having the words convey like what you are now eligible for, or what you are, what this level kind of means for you, right? So, I mean, we talked even specifically about saying like at level 1, eligible for expansion, like calling it that so that it's clear that that is what this level kind of means. But we also know that the levels aren't reduced to just those particular uses. And so that would have been very limiting in using something so specific. And so we also wanted to ensure that like it did give some indication for people who are the public who's using this information to know like good or bad, right? And so I think the colors help. I think, you know, some meeting and exceeding standards kind of is an accurate portrayal when we're talking about earning a certain percentage of points that are available to you.
Vice Chair Sandman.
Thank you.
I see your hand raised. Jim, did you have a question?
Just a comment. I started out favoring the concept, at least in the abstract, of having descriptors. I was motivated by my belief that as a general matter, more information is better than less. I thought it might be helpful to communicate something about what these numbers mean. This slide is very helpful to me, and it's flipped me 180 degrees. I look at, I mean, this is a very helpful thought exercise. When I look at option X, I think, well, what is the standard? What does that mean? I can't make anything of it without knowing what the standard is. I look at option Y and I look at a term like recognized performance. What does that mean? I look at option Z and I look at level 2, high performing. Well, a lot of my reaction to that might depend on how many schools were in that category. This is really hard stuff. And I'm influenced by what Nick said earlier. We, as the authorizer, we've never used the tier rankings alone as a basis for making decisions. We're much more nuanced than that. We look at particular indicators for the decisions that we have to make. So for neither of the 2 uses that all of this information is going to be put, for our use in making decisions about whether to renew charters, revoke charters, authorize enrollment ceiling increases, or in terms of informing the public, families making decisions, I think we're taking on too great a burden here. We run the risk of trying to turn terminology into magic information that just doesn't, life doesn't work that way. We've had a numbered system up until now. I propose we just stick with numbers. But thank you for this. You changed my mind.
So the only thing I do want to challenge us as a board to do, because I've heard it said a couple times here, while we have, I don't know in terms of, external, or I mean, but being new to the board, like what that looks externally and from a school leader standpoint, there have definitely been things that we have used our PMF tier ranking to do that did not include board discretion, right? And there are certain, and maybe it's because it never got elevated to the board, but if you weren't of a certain status or there were just certain things you weren't eligible for. In terms of policies and procedures, and where we did specifically look at a school's ranking in terms of their ability to do something or not do something. So I don't want us to be disingenuous and say that we have not just either granted or not granted schools things simply because of their PMF ranking, because we have.
Any other thoughts about naming or describing the levels with words and numbers?
I'll add that I just agree. I think numbers by itself makes sense. Yeah, and I think going back to what Board Member Wright said, I think we should just be deliberate about when we think the number is the number here is the most important thing, and when we think something underlying and nuanced is more important, and just try to be parsimonious about when and how we think actually the number determines a thing, as it were.
The number determining a thing and why. Among the many articulate and beautiful things you've said today, that that's capturing a lot of what I'm feeling right now. So I agree with the direction of this part of the conversation. I really appreciate the points made thus far.
I know part of our work in doing the second part of the charter goals policy is to both articulate how schools establish goals and what happens when schools meet or don't meet their goals. And I think there's opportunity to also talk about some of the other implications to policies that the board has. I did want to make an important point where I think the rub has come up in the past, which is when schools are up for renewal in particular, the board actually has less discretion to do some of the things that we've talked about than when schools are under review. And I do know that we have had other policies attached to, as Kirsten said earlier, tier 1 status. And so we have an opportunity in articulating the policy implications on how the framework is used to address those things in that policy. But I did want to just say that renewal is a time where there is less discretion, and scores matter if we say they matter, and performance and the ability of a school to meet or not meet its goals really matters at the point of renewal time, and has challenged any level of discretion that the board will have. And so I think it's important that we articulate both what the numbers mean, but also what the rewards and consequences are for meeting whatever thresholds we lay out.
Dr. Walker-Davis, to that point,
yes,
this board, prior to any of us serving on here, and what I expect going forward is that this is a work in progress, that past iterations, a 1.0, a 2.0, a 3.0, if this is the 3.0, if you will, then there will be a 3.1 and 2, et cetera. That as the technical guide, we will be learning as we roll this out. And it's critical that we are thoughtful about the policy implications and the practical implications of these decisions on how a school operates. I'm really sensitive to the point Board Members Wright's reminder just now of how the opportunities and options, the results, the tier ends up creating or closing for schools in service to their students. So I think perhaps this is a good segue to our wrap up of this roundtable of there are moving parts here, and this is an important addition to the ongoing development of this work.
Absolutely. And I would say that all of the advice, counsel, caution, and prayer that Dr. Rausch has offered us is going to be important in this, because I think at the end of the day, whether we name level 1 as highest performing, it will become known just as tier 1 is known as highest performing. And whether we name level 5 as lowest performing, it will be known as such, depending on what the policy implications are for each of those things. And quite frankly, what the math tells us is the case. And so our effort was to be transparent about naming these things and to be able to convey that these are the rewards and consequences associated with that. And I'm hearing a lot of concern, rightfully so, about one, getting the words right, but also whether there is more of a trade-off or a risk in starting there than there is in socializing what the actual numbers and level of performance means, and the danger that might come up with leading with these words, that we lose an opportunity to really pay attention to the things that matter. So we are walking away as staff with a lot of things to consider as we both work on a technical guide, but also bring forth a recommendation to the board as to what this framework needs to look like. And I am looking forward to more conversation over time with each of you individually, and also opportunities collectively as a board to dig in more on these. I want to ask, before I move us to close out, if there's anything that Kirsten wanted to leave us with, and then if there were any closing considerations that either Dr. Gill or Dr. Rausch wanted to leave with us before we let you off to your evening as well.
I just wanted to say thank you again to our guests and to our board for great conversation as usual, and really thoughtful questions. And Dr. Gill, it has been such a pleasure. He's been a great advisor for the past several months. And Dr. Rausch, it's always nice to see you and hear about your knowledge of nationwide practices as well as your personal experience. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And to the board, it's always fun. I will see you guys soon. And yeah, that's it.
Dr. Gill, any cautions that you have for us as we wrap?
I think I probably raised enough cautions already, but I'll just say that I'm very impressed with the quality of the discussion that you all are having, both on the staff and among members of the board. And you're asking all the right questions, and so I'm looking forward to seeing the end result.
Thank you. And Dr. Rausch, any parting words for us?
Not much, other than to continue to implore you to always think about, in these technical, important, nuanced conversations, that these are real kids and real kids' lives and real expectations and real schools that have real opportunities and real constraints. You're operating in, right, a context that is hard and complicated, and any accountability system isn't going to get everything right. I think the goal is to get most of it right, and to work really hard with other folks in your ecosystem to know where the blind spots are and to engage in it thoughtfully. And I'll leave you with something I learned very early on in my authorizing career that has informed a lot of the way that I, and I think a lot of folks in the field, right, think about this work, which is where you all are. And it's related to one of the things that Dr. Gill said earlier. And that's, we should never hold the school accountable for the quality of education that kids got before they got there, but you better hold them accountable for how well they accelerate in learning while they're there. That's just a very important, like, foundational element, and grateful to see you all working hard to try to get that right.
Thank you so much. Thank you both for your time in being here. Thank you, Kirsten and team, for all of the work that you do behind the scenes. Thank all of the other staff that aren't here today, but have been a part of this conversation. And most of all, thank you, board members. I feel so grateful to be working with this board at this particular time on this really, really, really important effort. And all of the things that you said, Dr. Rausch, is what motivates me to continue doing this work, but I'm really appreciative of the partnership that I have of the board members here. And I know that this is what keeps us all up at night getting this right. And I couldn't ask for a better team to be partnered with this work. So Chair Kruse, you have the last word to adjourn us, and I'll look forward to more conversations.
I'm closing with gratitude. To have the opportunity to serve alongside each one of you here, to serve alongside this incredible staff, and have the opportunity to learn from folks like Dr. Rausch, Dr. Gill. I think Dr. Rausch, you put that so beautifully to remind us that behind any kind of numbers and measurement science and all of that, it's grounded in people. And this is what we are working towards in service to the students of DC. So thank you, everybody. And this has been a big week. We have a lot more before us. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.